Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the bustling streets of General Santos City as 15-year-old Princess Pacquiao stepped through the glass doors of Casa Filipino, one of the most prestigious restaurants in the district. The establishment, with its warm wooden interiors and traditional Filipino decor, hummed with the gentle chatter of well-dressed patrons enjoying their late lunch. Princess had chosen this particular restaurant for a quiet study session with her two closest friends from school, hoping the elegant atmosphere would provide the perfect environment for their upcoming exams. Princess carried herself with the quiet confidence that came naturally to someone raised in the Pacquiao household, yet she deliberately avoided any displays of wealth or status. Her simple white blouse and modest jeans reflected the humility her father had instilled in all his children. She had learned early that respect should be earned through character, not through name recognition or material possessions. Today, she wanted nothing more than to blend in with the other students and enjoy a normal afternoon away from the constant attention that followed their family name. The hostess, a young woman named Teodora, greeted the three teenagers with a professional smile and guided them to a corner table near the large windows overlooking the garden. The location was perfect, quiet enough for studying, but bright enough to read comfortably. Princess settled into her seat, pulling out her mathematics textbook and notes while her friends arranged their own materials. The familiar sounds of silverware clinking against plates and the soft murmur of conversations created a soothing backdrop for their academic work. 20 minutes passed peacefully as the girls worked through complex algebraic equations, occasionally helping each other with difficult problems. Princess found herself genuinely enjoying the normalcy of the moment. In their household, meals were often interrupted by phone calls from promoters, meetings with business associates, or discussions about her father's various charitable projects. Here, surrounded by the gentle hum of everyday life, she could simply be a student preparing for her examinations. When their glasses of fresh calamansi juice ran empty, Princess politely raised her hand to catch the attention of their server. The young man who approached their table moved with obvious reluctance, his expression already showing signs of irritation before he had even reached them. Elmas, as his name tag indicated, appeared to be in his early 20s, with the kind of swagger that suggested he considered himself above serving what he perceived as ordinary teenagers who probably could not afford to tip generously. His eyes swept over their modest clothing and simple school supplies with unconcealed disdain. Without any attempt at courtesy, he stood beside their table with crossed arms, tapping his foot impatiently against the polished wooden floor. The contrast between his behavior and the restaurant's reputation for exceptional service was immediately apparent to Princess Dai, who had been raised to treat everyone with respect, regardless of their station in life. Princess requested additional beverages and asked politely about the afternoon dessert menu, maintaining her pleasant demeanor despite the server's obvious hostility. Elmer responded with barely concealed contempt, making it clear through his body language and tone that he considered their presence an inconvenience. His behavior grew increasingly disrespectful as he questioned their ability to pay for their order and suggested they might be more comfortable at a less expensive establishment down the street. The other patrons began to notice the commotion, their conversations growing quieter as they turned to observe the unfolding situation. Princess felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment, not for herself, but for the young man whose behavior reflected so poorly on the restaurant she knew her father had quietly purchased 6 months earlier as part of his expanding business portfolio in their hometown. Unbeknownst to everyone present, including Princess herself, Manny Pacquiao sat in his modest sedan in the parking lot outside, having arrived early for a scheduled meeting with the restaurant manager about upcoming renovations and staff training programs. Princess felt the weight of every stare as Elmer continued his display of unprofessional behavior, his voice growing louder and more condescending with each passing moment. The young server seemed to take perverse pleasure in making the teenagers feel unwelcome, apparently convinced that their youthful appearance and modest attire meant they posed no threat to his employment. His assumption that they were simply ordinary students without connections or influence emboldened him to push the boundaries of acceptable behavior even further. The restaurant's other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, witnessing an interaction that clearly violated the establishment's reputation for treating every guest with dignity and respect. An elderly couple at a nearby table exchanged worried glances, the gentleman appearing ready to intervene on behalf of the young women. At another table, a business lunch between two prominent local entrepreneurs came to a halt as they watched the unfolding drama with growing disapproval. Princess maintained her composure despite the mounting embarrassment, drawing upon the lessons in grace under pressure that her mother Jinky had taught her throughout her childhood. She understood that responding with anger or indignation would only escalate the situation and potentially create a scene that could reflect poorly on her family's reputation. Instead, she chose to demonstrate the kind of quiet dignity that had become synonymous with the Pacquiao name, even as her heart raced with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. Her two friends, however, struggled to contain their outrage at witnessing their companion being treated with such blatant disrespect. Marilu, Princess's closest friend since elementary school, gripped her pencil so tightly that her knuckles turned white, while Remedios kept glancing toward the restaurant's front desk, clearly considering whether to report the server's behavior to management. Both girls had spent enough time in the Pacquiao household to understand the family's values of humility and kindness, but they also recognized injustice when they saw it. Elmer's behavior reached new depths of unprofessionalism as he began to question not only their ability to pay, but also their right to occupy a table during the restaurant's busy afternoon period. He suggested with obvious sarcasm that they might find the local fast food establishments more suitable to their apparent budget constraints. His comments carried undertones that went beyond simple rudeness, crossing into territory that bordered on class-based discrimination and prejudice against young people. The irony of the situation was lost on everyone present except for Amado, the restaurant's assistant manager, who had just emerged from the kitchen and recognized Princess immediately. Having worked closely with the Pacquiao family's business interests for several months, he understood the gravity of what he was witnessing. However, positioned across the dining room and engaged in directing the kitchen staff during the lunch rush, he found himself temporarily unable to intervene in the unfolding confrontation. Outside in the parking lot, Manny completed a phone call with his business partner regarding their upcoming expansion into the hotel industry. The conversation had run longer than expected, but he felt energized by the possibilities they had discussed for creating more employment opportunities in their hometown. He gathered his papers from the passenger seat, straightened his simple polo shirt, and stepped out of his vehicle, completely unaware that his daughter was experiencing humiliation just meters away inside his own establishment. The afternoon heat shimmered off the asphalt as he walked toward the restaurant's entrance, nodding politely to the security guard who recognized him but maintained the discreet professionalism that Manny preferred. He had specifically instructed his staff to treat him like any other business owner when he visited his establishments, wanting to observe their normal operations without the artificial performance that often accompanied visits from prominent figures. As he approached the glass doors, Manny could see through the windows that the dining room appeared busy and prosperous, exactly what he had hoped to achieve when he had quietly purchased the struggling restaurant 6 months earlier. His investment had been motivated not by profit potential alone, but by his desire to preserve jobs for the local community and maintain a gathering place where families could create positive memories together. The automatic doors whispered open before him, and he stepped into an atmosphere thick with tension he could not yet understand. Manny's experienced eyes immediately swept across the dining room as he entered, a habit developed through years of assessing crowds and reading atmospheres. The subtle tension that permeated the space was unmistakable to someone who had spent decades performing under pressure and navigating complex social dynamics. Something was clearly wrong, though he could not yet identify the source of the discomfort that seemed to hang in the air like an invisible cloud. His gaze moved methodically from table to table, noting the way conversations had grown muted and how several patrons kept glancing toward the far corner of the restaurant. The normal flow of a successful lunch service had been disrupted by something significant enough to capture the attention of nearly every guest in the establishment. Manny's instincts, honed through countless situations where reading a room could mean the difference between success and failure, told him that whatever was happening demanded immediate attention. As he moved deeper into the restaurant, weaving between tables with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in any environment, Manny's attention was drawn to a commotion near the windows. The body language of the people involved suggested a confrontation of some kind, though the specific details remained unclear from his position near the entrance. He quickened his pace slightly, his natural protective instincts activated by the obvious distress he could observe even from a distance. The moment of recognition hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Among the three young women seated at the corner table, he immediately identified the familiar profile and posture of his daughter, Princess. The realization that she was present in his restaurant should have filled him with pleasure, but the context made it clear that something had gone terribly wrong. The defensive way she held herself, the obvious discomfort of her companions, and the aggressive stance of the young server standing over their table painted a picture that filled Manny with a cold fury unlike anything he had experienced in years. Princess sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, displaying the dignity and composure that made Manny proud under normal circumstances. But today, those same qualities were being tested by circumstances that no young person should have to endure. Her friends flanked her protectively, their expressions revealing a mixture of outrage and helplessness that resonated deeply with Manny's own growing anger at the situation unfolding before his eyes. Elmer continued his unprofessional behavior, apparently oblivious to the dangerous ground he was treading. His body language radiated the kind of arrogant confidence that came from someone who believed themselves immune from consequences. The young server's assumption that these teenagers possessed no power or influence had led him to cross lines that would have career-ending implications if he had understood the true nature of his targets. The other restaurant patrons watched the scene with growing discomfort, their enjoyment of their meals completely forgotten in the face of such obvious injustice. Several guests appeared to be considering intervention, but the social dynamics of the situation created a hesitancy that allowed the confrontation to continue unchecked. The atmosphere in the dining room had shifted from pleasant conversation to tense observation, with nearly every eye focused on the corner table. Manny felt the familiar surge of protective instinct that had driven him through countless challenges in his boxing career and business ventures. The sight of his daughter being treated with such disrespect in his own establishment created a perfect storm of personal outrage and professional responsibility. Every step closer to the table increased his understanding of the severity of the situation and strengthened his resolve to address it decisively. Amado finally broke free from his kitchen responsibilities and began moving toward the confrontation, but his progress was slowed by the need to navigate between occupied tables and avoid creating additional disruption. His recognition of Princess and understanding of the potential consequences gave his movements an urgency that unfortunately came too late to prevent the situation from escalating further. The distance between Manny and his daughter seemed to stretch endlessly as he approached, each second allowing him to absorb more details of the humiliation she was enduring with such remarkable grace. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on Manny's shoulders as he continued his approach, each step bringing him closer to a confrontation that would test every principle he had tried to instill in his children and employees. The lessons he had learned about dignity, respect, and appropriate response to adversity would all be called upon in the next few moments. His breathing remained controlled, but his heart rate increased as the full scope of his daughter's humiliation became clear. Princess maintained her composure with the kind of strength that reminded Manny of her mother's grace under pressure, but he could see the subtle signs of distress that only a father would recognize. The slight tension in her shoulders, the way she kept her eyes focused on her textbook, rather than engaging with the antagonistic server, and the protective posture of her friends, all confirmed that this was not simply a minor misunderstanding, but a sustained pattern of disrespectful behavior. Other patrons began to recognize Manny as he moved through the dining room, their whispered conversations adding another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. A middle-aged businessman at a corner booth leaned toward his lunch companion, clearly identifying the boxing legend who had just entered what was apparently his own restaurant. The recognition spread like ripples across the dining room, creating an undercurrent of anticipation that would make any resolution of the conflict highly visible and potentially public. Elmer's behavior reached new depths of unprofessionalism as he continued his verbal assault on the three young women, completely unaware that he was being observed by both his employer and an increasing number of concerned patrons. His confidence in his perceived immunity from consequences had grown to dangerous proportions, leading him to make comments that crossed every line of acceptable customer service. The irony that he was treating the owner's daughter with such contempt would have been amusing under different circumstances. The restaurant's head server, Dolores, emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of desserts for another table and immediately sensed the change in atmosphere. Her 30 years of experience in hospitality made her acutely aware of the shift in energy that signaled serious trouble. However, her position across the dining room and her obligations to other guests prevented her from immediately intervening in what was clearly becoming a crisis situation. Manny's mind raced through possible responses to the unfolding drama, weighing his desire to protect his daughter against his responsibility to handle the situation in a way that would serve as a teaching moment for everyone involved. The boxer in him wanted immediate and decisive action, while the businessman understood the need for measured response that would preserve the restaurant's reputation and his family's dignity. The physical distance between father and daughter continued to close, but the emotional distance created by witnessing her humiliation seemed to expand with each passing second. Manny's protective instincts warred with his understanding that Princess was demonstrating exactly the kind of character he had tried to develop in all his children. Her refusal to respond with anger or demand special treatment showed maturity beyond her years. Amado finally freed himself from his kitchen responsibilities and began moving more urgently toward the corner table, his recognition of both Princess and the approaching Manny creating a sense of panic about the potential consequences of allowing this situation to continue. His knowledge of the family's values and the restaurant's policies made him understand that multiple failures of leadership were about to be exposed in the most public way possible. The ambient noise of the restaurant had diminished to whispers and the gentle clinking of silverware as more patrons became aware that something significant was unfolding. The normal rhythms of a successful lunch service had been completely disrupted by one employee's spectacular failure to understand his responsibilities. Manny reached the invisible boundary where casual observation transformed into direct involvement. His presence now close enough to the corner table, that intervention was inevitable. The controlled fury that had been building throughout his approach crystallized into the kind of focused determination that had carried him through championship fights against impossible odds. Every muscle in his body remained relaxed, but his eyes carried the intensity that opponents had learned to fear during his legendary boxing career. Princess sensed a change in the atmosphere before she saw her father, the subtle shift in energy that indicated someone significant had entered their immediate vicinity. Her peripheral vision caught the familiar silhouette, and her heart skipped with a mixture of relief and concern about how the situation might escalate. The quiet strength she had been drawing upon suddenly felt reinforced by the knowledge that her father was near, though she also worried about the potential consequences of his legendary protective instincts. Elmer continued his unprofessional behavior, his back turned to Manny's approach, and his attention completely focused on what he perceived as easy targets for his misplaced aggression. The young server's voice had grown increasingly loud and disrespectful, his comments crossing boundaries that would have resulted in immediate termination under normal circumstances. His assumption that these teenagers had no recourse or influence continued to fuel his increasingly reckless behavior. The recognition among other patrons created a wave of whispered excitement, mixed with anticipation of justice finally being served. Veteran diners, who had followed Manny's career for decades, exchanged knowing glances, understanding that they were about to witness the kind of moment that would become restaurant legend. The businessman who had first identified the boxing champion discreetly pulled out his phone, though whether to record the encounter or call for assistance remained unclear. Amado finally broke free from the constraints of his other responsibilities and began moving with genuine urgency toward the developing confrontation. His face reflected the horror of someone who understood exactly how catastrophic this situation could become for everyone involved, particularly for Elmer, whose ignorance of his target's identity had led him into territory from which there might be no professional recovery. Marilu and Remedios positioned themselves slightly closer to Princess, their protective instincts activated by the escalating tension and their awareness that the situation was about to change dramatically. Both girls had spent enough time around the Pacquiao family to recognize the signs that intervention was imminent, though they could never have predicted the form it would take. The restaurant's ambient noise dropped to near silence as conversations halted and silverware remained suspended between plates and mouths. The collective attention of the dining room focused on the corner table like a spotlight, creating the kind of pressure-filled atmosphere that Manny knew well from his boxing days. The difference was that this time, he was fighting for his daughter's dignity rather than championship belts. Dolores abandoned her dessert service and began moving toward the confrontation, her decades of experience telling her that whatever was about to happen would require immediate damage control and possibly emergency management intervention. Her knowledge of the restaurant's ownership structure made her understand the full scope of the disaster that was unfolding before her eyes. Elmer's voice reached a crescendo of disrespect, just as Manny stepped into his field of vision, the timing creating a perfect storm of confrontation that would forever change the young server's understanding of consequences and respect. The moment when recognition dawned would become the pivotal point around which the entire encounter would revolve. The air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation, as two very different worlds prepared to collide in the most public and dramatic way possible. The moment Elmer turned to address what he assumed was another customer seeking his attention, his world tilted on its axis with devastating suddenness. The face that met his gaze belonged to one of the most recognizable figures in Philippine history, a man whose image had graced magazine covers, billboards, and television screens across the nation for over 2 decades. The blood drained from Elmer's face as the full magnitude of his catastrophic error began to register in his consciousness. Manny stood motionless, his presence alone commanding the kind of respect that required no words or gestures. The controlled power that had made him a legend in the boxing ring was evident in every line of his posture, though his expression remained carefully neutral. Years of facing dangerous opponents had taught him the value of psychological pressure, and the weight of his silent observation was more effective than any verbal confrontation could have been. The transformation in Elmer was immediate and complete. His aggressive stance crumbled into trembling uncertainty as he struggled to process the implications of having spent the last 20 minutes treating the daughter of Manny Pacquiao with contempt and disrespect. The realization that he had been berating the child of a national hero in that hero's own establishment created a level of panic that bordered on physical illness. Princess watched her father with a mixture of admiration and concern, recognizing the restraint he was exercising, despite what must have been overwhelming anger at witnessing her humiliation. The composure he maintained in the face of such provocation demonstrated the kind of character that had made him beloved throughout the Philippines and beyond. Her own dignity felt restored simply by his presence, though she worried about the consequences for the young server who had made such a spectacular error in judgment. The entire restaurant had fallen into complete silence, every patron understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would be discussed and retold for years to come. The businessman with his phone had lowered it, recognizing that some moments were too significant to reduce to mere recording. The elderly couple who had considered intervention earlier now sat in stunned amazement at the dramatic turn of events. Amado reached the periphery of the confrontation just as the full impact of the situation became clear to everyone involved. His face reflected the horror of a man watching his professional reputation dissolve in real time, knowing that this incident would define his management tenure regardless of how it was ultimately resolved. The assistant manager's understanding of both the family's values and the restaurant's policies made him uniquely aware of how many protocols had been violated. Dolores abandoned all pretense of normal service and positioned herself where she could respond immediately to whatever direction the encounter might take. Her decades of experience in hospitality had never prepared her for a situation of this magnitude, where customer service failures intersected with celebrity status and family relationships in such a publicly visible way. Elmer's legs appeared to lose their ability to support his weight as the full scope of his predicament became clear. The confident swagger that had characterized his behavior moments earlier had been replaced by visible trembling and the kind of pale complexion that suggested he might faint from the stress of his realization. His eyes darted between Manny's impassive face and Princess's composed expression, seeking some sign of mercy that might not be forthcoming. The silence stretched endlessly, filled with the kind of tension that preceded life-changing moments. Every person present understood that whatever happened next would serve as a defining example of how consequences followed actions, particularly when those actions violated basic principles of respect and human dignity. Manny's next move would reveal not only his character as a father, but also his principles as a businessman and public figure. Manny's response to the situation reflected the wisdom accumulated through decades of public life and the deep values instilled by his own humble beginnings. Rather than allowing anger to dictate his actions, he chose a path that would serve as a teaching moment for everyone present, including his daughter, who watched with rapt attention. The boxing champion's greatest victory was not happening in any ring, but in this moment of supreme self-control and moral leadership. The gentle gesture with which Manny placed his hand on Princess's shoulder communicated volumes without requiring words. His touch conveyed both protection and pride, acknowledging the grace with which she had handled an impossible situation while simultaneously signaling that her ordeal was over. The simple contact between father and daughter created a powerful image of family unity that resonated throughout the silent restaurant. Elmer's complete physical collapse became inevitable as the full weight of his actions settled upon him. The young server sank into a nearby chair, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he struggled to comprehend how drastically his life had changed in the span of a few moments. The arrogance that had characterized his behavior toward the teenagers had been replaced by genuine terror about his future employment prospects and reputation within the community. Manny's attention turned to the broader restaurant staff, his gaze encompassing Amado and Dolores as well as other employees who had gathered at a respectful distance. His expression made it clear that this incident represented a systemic failure of training and supervision that would require immediate and comprehensive attention. The restaurant's reputation and the trust of its patrons had been compromised by one individual's behavior, but the responsibility extended far beyond a single server. The other patrons remained frozen in place, understanding that they were witnessing a masterclass in leadership and conflict resolution from one of their nation's most respected figures. The businessman who had first recognized Manny found himself taking mental notes about how true authority was exercised through restraint rather than aggression. The elderly couple exchanged glances that spoke to their admiration for the dignity being displayed under such trying circumstances. Princess observed her father's handling of the situation with deep appreciation for the values he was demonstrating. Even in the face of a direct attack on his family, Manny chose education over retaliation, understanding over anger, and growth over punishment. The lesson was not lost on her friends either, who witnessed firsthand how true strength was measured not by the ability to dominate others, but by the wisdom to respond proportionally and constructively. Amado approached with the careful steps of someone hoping to salvage what remained of his professional credibility. His recognition that this incident would define his tenure as assistant manager was evident in every aspect of his body language. The protocols that should have prevented this situation from occurring in the first place had failed spectacularly, and the responsibility for that failure rested squarely on his shoulders. The transformation in the restaurant's atmosphere was complete and irreversible. What had begun as a normal lunch service had evolved into a community-wide lesson about respect, consequences, and the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of their apparent status or influence. The silence that had fallen over the dining room was not uncomfortable but reverent, as if everyone present understood they were participating in something significant. Dolores positioned herself to respond to whatever instructions might be forthcoming, her decades of experience telling her that comprehensive changes would be necessary to restore the establishment's reputation and prevent similar incidents in the future. The head server's understanding of hospitality standards made her acutely aware of how far below acceptable levels their service had fallen. Manny's next actions would determine not only Elmer's immediate fate, but also set the tone for how the restaurant would operate moving forward. Manny's decision in that pivotal moment would become legendary throughout General Santos City, not for its harshness, but for its unexpected compassion. Instead of demanding immediate termination or public humiliation for Elmer, the boxing champion chose a path that reflected the core values he had learned during his own journey from poverty to prominence. His response demonstrated that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy those who wronged you, but in the wisdom to transform negative situations into opportunities for growth and redemption. The hand signal Manny gave to Amado indicated that a private conversation would be necessary, but not the explosive confrontation that everyone had anticipated. His gesture toward a quiet corner of the restaurant suggested that this matter would be handled with discretion rather than public spectacle. The collective exhale from the dining room's patrons was audible as they realized they would witness reconciliation rather than retribution. Elmer's journey to that private corner required assistance from Dolores, whose steadying hand on his arm prevented what appeared to be an imminent collapse. The young server's legs trembled with each step as he processed the magnitude of mercy being extended to him, despite his inexcusable behavior. His face reflected a mixture of terror and disbelief that such grace was possible in the face of his spectacular failure of judgment and professionalism. Princess watched her father's handling of the crisis with profound admiration, understanding that she was witnessing the principles that had guided her upbringing being applied under the most challenging circumstances. The lesson about responding to adversity with dignity rather than anger would stay with her long after this afternoon ended. Her friends observed with equal fascination, recognizing that they were learning from one of the Philippines' most respected leaders about real-world conflict resolution. The private conversation that followed lasted nearly 20 minutes, during which the restaurant's normal operations gradually resumed with subdued efficiency. Other patrons found their voices again, though their conversations frequently returned to speculation about the outcome of the meeting taking place in the corner. The businessman who had recognized Manny earlier was already composing the story he would tell colleagues about witnessing authentic leadership in action. When the three men emerged from their discussion, Elmer's appearance had been transformed. Though still pale and shaken, he carried himself with a different posture that suggested profound understanding of both the gravity of his mistakes and the incredible opportunity for redemption he had been granted. His eyes held the kind of humility that could only come from facing the consequences of one's actions and discovering unexpected mercy. Manny's brief conversation with his daughter before departing demonstrated the gentle father behind the public figure. His kiss on her forehead and encouraging smile conveyed pride in how she had handled an impossible situation while reinforcing that she was loved and protected. The gesture also served as a final lesson for everyone present about the importance of family and unconditional support. The changes that followed in the weeks ahead would transform Casa Filipino from a simple restaurant into a training ground for exceptional service and respect. Elmer became the establishment's most dedicated employee, his transformation serving as a living example of how people could grow from their mistakes when given proper guidance and second chances. His story spread throughout the service industry, becoming a cautionary tale about assumptions and a hopeful narrative about redemption. Princess returned to Casa Filipino regularly in the months that followed, always receiving service that reflected the highest standards of hospitality and respect. The corner table where her ordeal had occurred became her preferred study spot, transformed from a place of humiliation into a symbol of her father's wisdom and the power of forgiveness to create positive change in the world. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.